The doors of the First National Bank opened with a soft chime as Jacob Brown stepped inside, his boots clicking against the polished marble floor. He didn't fit the typical image of the clientele the bank usually catered to, dressed in worn jeans, a faded plaid shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. His presence barely caused a stir, yet the bank's atmosphere shifted, growing tense the moment he approached the counter. Catherine Davis, the bank manager, eyed him from her perch, her gaze immediately cold and calculating. Without hesitation, she strutted towards him, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her voice dripping with disdain as she spoke. "You don't belong here." Her words, though harsh, didn't shock Jacob. He had been the target of such prejudice before. What he didn't expect, however, was how far she would go to humiliate him in front of a room full of witnesses. As he reached for his wallet to complete a simple transaction, Catherine's voice rose even higher, commanding the room. "Get out now. We don't serve people like you." The atmosphere grew thick with tension, but Jacob stood firm, his expression calm and unwavering. He could feel the eyes of the other customers on him, but he refused to let the indignity of the moment break his composure. But there was more at stake than just this one instance of injustice. He had a plan, and this was only the beginning. Jacob didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath and calmly pulled out his phone. He knew the system he had in place, Protocol 6, a failsafe designed to protect him from moments like this. He dialed Nia, his assistant, the words, "Activate Protocol 6, flowing with a level of authority that startled even him. As the phone connected, he could feel the weight of the situation shift. Nia's voice came through, sharp and precise. "It's done. We're logging the incident now." Catherine, her anger rising, shot him a smug look as she called security, clearly thinking this was the end of the story. But Jacob knew better. What she didn't realize was that she had just sealed her own fate. In the calmest of tones, Jacob stood up, the chair scraping behind him. "You called me a fraud in the company I own." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and the room fell silent. Catherine froze, the smug expression faltering for a split second, and the other customers began whispering among themselves. The manager's grip tightened on the counter, her face flushing red as her authority crumbled in front of her. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about power, dignity, and the fight for respect. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the weight of what was about to unfold. Jacob remained composed, his stance unshaken as Catherine scrambled to regain control of the situation. She ordered her staff to call the police, but Jacob simply nodded and dialed his corporate contacts. "Send the audit logs and freeze her access now," he instructed, his voice unwavering. The clock was ticking, and the pieces were falling into place. The police arrived moments later, their presence adding to the growing pressure. However, the officer's demeanor shifted when he noticed Jacob's calm authority. Catherine's face was flushed with panic, but it was too late. Jacob had already won. As he turned to the officer and said, "Escort her out," the bank employees watched in stunned silence. The officer hesitated, then moved forward. The staff, once loyal to Catherine, now stood frozen, unable to process the shift in power. Jacob's quiet resolve had turned the tide. Catherine's reign was over in a matter of minutes. The power dynamic had completely flipped, and the justice that was so long denied was finally being served. Jacob's voice cut through the silence one last time as he addressed the room. "I didn't raise my voice. I raised the standard." The words echoed, a powerful reminder to everyone in the room of the true meaning of authority. No longer was this a place where judgment and discrimination could thrive unchecked. Jacob had not only reclaimed his dignity but had sent a powerful message to all those who would dare to judge him based on his appearance. As the officer escorted Catherine out, the room erupted in quiet applause, and Jacob walked calmly towards the exit, knowing that his actions had made a lasting impact. The silence that had filled the bank moments before was now filled with respect and awe. Jacob had not just defended his honor, he had shattered the system of bias that tried to silence him. Jacob stood motionless as the security officer guided Catherine out of the room, her face still flushed with the humiliation of being publicly exposed. The other employees watched in stunned silence, some unsure of what had just happened, others already beginning to process the gravity of the situation. Jacob's calm demeanor never wavered as he adjusted his jacket, the tension in the room slowly dissipating. For a moment, it seemed as though nothing had changed. The polished marble floors, the sleek counters, The shining logo of the First National Bank, everything looked the same, but the atmosphere had shifted, like the calm before a storm. The other customers, who had been too quiet to act before, now found themselves in a position they couldn't ignore. They had witnessed injustice firsthand, and something in their minds had clicked. The bank was no longer a symbol of power, it was a place where the truth had just been revealed. Jacob's eyes scanned the room, briefly meeting the eyes of a few clients who had witnessed the scene. Their gaze was no longer one of indifference. There was a flicker of respect now. They had seen how quickly power could shift, how easily it could unravel. It was no longer about the money, it was about the way people like him had been treated for far too long, based on assumptions and biases they had no right to impose. As the final echoes of Catherine's departure faded away, Jacob turned back to the counter, his gaze falling on the teller who had been silent through it all. She seemed unsure of what to do, her hands shaking slightly as she avoided his eyes. Jacob's voice was soft but firm as he addressed her. "Can I proceed with my transaction now?" The teller nodded, still looking uncomfortable. She typed into the system, clearly aware of the implications of what had just occurred. Jacob wasn't about to let this small victory slip away. This was just the beginning. He had made a point. Now, he was going to make sure that the system he had helped build would be a system of fairness, not one of bias. As he took his money from the counter, he could feel the weight of the moment. The balance had tipped. No one could pretend they didn't see what had happened here. The system, the very foundation of this bank, had just been shaken to its core. It wasn't just about the moment, it was about every moment that had led to it. Every time someone like him had been underestimated, dismissed, or discriminated against simply because of how they looked. Jacob had a lot of work ahead of him, but this was a start. As he turned to leave, the tension in the room had transformed into something else, entirely something more powerful. Respect had replaced fear. Jacob Brown had just made his mark, and the First National Bank would never be the same again. Jacob stepped out of the bank, the heavy doors closing behind him with a soft thud, as if marking the finality of the moment. The cool breeze hit his face, but it did little to shake the weight of what had just happened. His mind was still processing the scene he had just left, the tension that had built and then exploded in the most unexpected of ways. But beneath the shock of it all, there was a feeling of satisfaction, a sense of justice finally being served, and a deep-rooted belief that the actions of the past had led him to this moment. As he made his way to his car, he couldn't help but think of how many people had been silenced by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them, how many had been overlooked or dismissed simply because of who they were. His experience that day wasn't just his own, it was the experience of every person who had been told they didn't belong, every person who had been dismissed because of their appearance or their background. For years, he had worked tirelessly to build a reputation, to prove that he could stand toe-to-toe with the best of them, but moments like the one inside that bank reminded him that his journey was far from over. The battle for respect, for fairness, was something that would always need to be fought. As he drove through the streets, his thoughts kept returning to Catherine, the bank manager who had tried to humiliate him. He could still see the way her eyes had widened when he revealed who he was, how quickly she had lost control the moment she realized the person she had treated like dirt was actually the owner of the institution she worked for. It wasn't just about getting the money or proving a point anymore, it was about changing the narrative, about showing that no matter what someone looked like or where they came from, they had the right to be treated with dignity. But Jacob knew this wouldn't be the end of his journey. He had made a small dent in the armor of the system that had so often worked against him, but he was aware that these battles were never won in a single moment. It would take time, persistence, and a commitment to ensuring that others wouldn't have to go through the same experience. As his car turned down a quiet street, Jacob's phone buzzed. It was a text from Nia, his assistant. The message was short, but it hit hard. "The board is aware. They're starting the review. Protocol 6 is in motion." Jacob smiled to himself, a sense of calm washing over him as he realized that the ripple effects of his actions were already being felt. The system was moving, and change was coming. He wasn't just a victim of the system anymore, he was part of the force that would make sure things were different moving forward. As he pulled into his driveway, he took a deep breath, the weight of the day finally starting to lift. This was only the beginning, but Jacob was ready. The fight for respect, for justice, was far from over, but it had taken a significant step forward that day. Jacob woke up the next morning to a series of texts from Nia, his assistant. The first one read, "The board is already reviewing the incident. They're taking this seriously." The second text was more detailed. "Catherine's access has been revoked. Protocol 6 is now fully active, and the audit is in progress. Everyone's on high alert." Jacob felt a rush of satisfaction mixed with a sense of urgency. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The fight he had started in that bank wasn't confined to one building or one institution. It was part of something much bigger. It was about reshaping the system from within, about ensuring that no one would ever be treated the way Catherine had treated him. As he sipped his coffee, Jacob thought about the ripple effect his actions had already caused. His name was now in the corporate world's spotlight, and there were many who would either rally behind him or work to undermine him. He had become a symbol of resistance, of silent power, and of reclaiming what was rightfully his. The implications of his confrontation in the bank were still unfolding, and Jacob knew the fight was far from over. His next step was clear. He needed to ensure that the policies that had allowed this type of discrimination to fester were addressed and reformed. He wasn't just going to let this moment be a one-time victory, he was going to make sure it left a lasting impact. As he prepared to head out for the day, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email notification from his lawyer. The subject line read, "Legal action against Catherine Davis." The email outlined the steps to be taken next: formal complaints, an internal review of her actions, and potential legal consequences. Jacob's heart sank a little as he read through the document. This wasn't just a matter of corporate policies being violated, it was a matter of personal dignity, and the legal ramifications would be significant. The moment he had revealed his true identity in the bank had been a turning point, but it had also opened up a whole new chapter in the struggle for justice. As Jacob read on, he realized that Catherine's actions had violated not only company protocol but also the very principles of fairness and equality that he had worked his whole life to build. Catherine's attempt to humiliate him had backfired in the most spectacular way, and now it was time for her to face the consequences of her behavior. Jacob wasn't one to take pleasure in someone else's downfall, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of justice in the air. She had misjudged him, and now she would have to answer for it. But beyond that, this was about a much larger issue. It was about changing the culture that had allowed her to act that way in the first place. Jacob closed his laptop, taking a deep breath. It was time to meet with his team and ensure that they stayed focused on the bigger picture. The battle wasn't just about one individual, it was about changing the system, and he was ready to take that fight to the next level. Jacob sat in his office, the afternoon sun streaming through the window, casting a warm glow over his desk. The day had been long, filled with meetings and calls, but his mind kept returning to the incident at the bank. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, not just for his personal journey, but for something bigger, something that could potentially change the very fabric of the institutions he had spent his career building. He glanced at his phone as it buzzed again, this time with an update from his legal team. The email contained a detailed breakdown of the internal review that was now underway at First National Bank. It was clear that the situation was escalating quickly. Jacob could already feel the pressure mounting from both sides, the people who wanted him to let it go, and the others who saw this as an opportunity to make a statement. But Jacob knew he couldn't let this moment pass without making sure that what happened to him wouldn't happen to anyone else. The bank had discriminated against him, but it wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of a larger, systemic problem. Catherine's actions had exposed the cracks in a system built on outdated and biased views. He had to do something about it. His phone buzzed once more, breaking his train of thought. It was a message from Nia, simply saying, "The board wants to meet. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. They're ready to hear your vision." Jacob smiled to himself, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. This was it. This was the chance he had been waiting for, the chance to make real change, not just in one institution, but across an entire system. He had already proven that one individual could make a difference, but now he needed to prove that change was possible on a much larger scale. As the evening wore on, Jacob sat back in his chair, reflecting on how far he had come. The quiet strength he had shown in the bank had already begun to ripple through the industry. People were talking, and that was exactly what he needed. Change would never come if people remained silent, if they kept their heads down and let the system continue to function as it always had. Jacob was done with silence. He was ready to speak out and to challenge the norms that had allowed injustice to thrive for so long. Tomorrow's meeting with the board would be the next step in his journey, and he was prepared. He was ready to take his place as a leader, not just in business, but in the fight for equality and fairness. His phone buzzed once more, and this time it was a reminder about the meeting. He set the phone down, his mind already racing with the plans and ideas he would present. The battle was just beginning, but Jacob felt more confident than ever. He had a vision, and now it was time to make that vision a reality. The next morning, Jacob walked into the boardroom with a sense of calm determination. The room was filled with the usual faces, the top executives of the company, each one watching him with a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. Jacob had been in high-stakes meetings before, but this one felt different. The weight of the situation hung heavily in the air. The incident at First National Bank had already made waves across the industry, and now Jacob stood at the center of it all. He had not only exposed a deep-seated issue of racial discrimination within the bank, but had also put himself at the forefront of a much larger conversation about inequality in corporate America. As he took his seat at the head of the table, he could feel the eyes of the board members on him, waiting for him to speak. He had been through a lot to get to this point, but he was ready. He was no longer the quiet businessman who had silently accepted the biases that came with his position. He had fought for respect, and now it was time to fight for real change. "Good morning," Jacob began, his voice steady and confident. "I'm here today because what happened at First National Bank is a reflection of a much bigger issue, one that's not just isolated to a single institution, but one that runs through the very core of our business practices." He paused, allowing his words to settle in the room. The board members exchanged glances, some of them uncomfortable, others intrigued. Jacob could tell they weren't used to this kind of direct confrontation. For years, the system had been allowed to function without challenge, and now Jacob was about to disrupt that. "We are all aware of the systemic issues that plague our society, issues of race, class, and privilege. But we've failed to acknowledge how those same issues are deeply embedded in the way our company operates," Jacob continued, his voice growing firmer. "Catherine Davis's actions at the bank weren't just about her personal biases. They were a direct result of the culture we've allowed to thrive. It's time to make a change." The room was silent as Jacob's words sank in. He could feel the weight of the moment, but he was undeterred. This was his time, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. "I'm not here to make excuses or to let anyone off the hook. We need a real, structural change," Jacob said. "We need to reassess our hiring practices, our training, and most importantly, the way we view our employees and our customers. We need to create an environment where people are treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or appearance." Jacob could see the tension in the room as the board members processed his words. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was prepared to do whatever it took to bring about this change. "This is not just a matter of corporate responsibility, it's a moral issue," he said, looking around the room. "And it's time we take responsibility for the culture we've created. We need to lead by example." Jacob paused again, letting the room absorb the gravity of his statement. He wasn't just speaking to the board members in front of him, he was speaking to the entire company, to the industry, and to anyone who had ever been made to feel less than because of who they were. "The decision we make here today will not just affect our company, it will affect the future of the industry as a whole," Jacob concluded. "I am asking for your support in making this vision a reality. This is the only way we can move forward." The room remained silent for a moment before one of the board members finally spoke up, his voice tentative. "Jacob, this is a bold approach, but it's one that's long overdue," Jacob nodded, knowing that this was just the beginning. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready to face whatever came next. The fight for equality, for respect, had only just begun. The meeting room was filled with an energy that was both charged and uncertain as Jacob's words echoed in the ears of the board members. For the first time in a long while, the executives were faced with a challenge that wasn't about profit margins, growth, or market share. It was about accountability, integrity, and a deep cultural shift that needed to happen. Jacob leaned back in his chair, allowing the silence to linger just long enough for everyone in the room to fully absorb what he had said. He wasn't here to appease anyone, he was here to spark a revolution within the company, and by extension, the industry itself. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was necessary. The moments ticked by slowly, each second feeling like an eternity, until the chair of the board, ***, Richard Walters, ***, finally spoke up. his voice laced with a mixture of skepticism and reluctant admiration. "Jacob, I can't say I've ever heard anything like this in a board meeting before," Richard said, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "You're talking about a massive shift in not just our policies, but our culture." Jacob nodded slowly, his expression unwavering. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. This isn't about incremental change. It's about transforming the way we operate at a fundamental level." Another board member, Lindsay Green, the head of HR, chimed in, clearly conflicted. "You're asking us to completely overhaul our recruitment practices, our diversity initiatives, and how we handle customer interactions. That's a huge undertaking. Are we really ready for that?" Jacob's gaze remained steady as he looked around the room. "We have no choice," he said firmly. "We can no longer ignore the systemic issues that have been allowed to fester in this company. The treatment I experienced at the bank was not an isolated incident. It is part of a larger pattern that we, as an organization, have contributed to. If we don't address it now, we risk continuing down a path that perpetuates discrimination, bias, and inequality. It's not just about doing the right thing, it's about survival." The room was tense, the weight of Jacob's words pressing down on each of them. Jacob knew he was pushing them to confront uncomfortable truths, but he also knew that this was the moment when the company would either step up or fall behind. It wasn't just about changing policies, it was about changing hearts and minds, and that was always the hardest part. Richard looked at his colleagues, a long pause hanging between them as they absorbed what Jacob had said. "You're asking us to take a risk," he said finally, his tone a bit softer. "This could change everything. But I have to admit, Jacob, you've given us something to think about." Jacob leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with Richard's. "This isn't a risk, it's an opportunity to lead the way, to set a new standard for how businesses should operate. We can't keep pretending these issues don't exist. We need to show the world that we are committed to creating an environment where everyone is treated with dignity, regardless of their race, gender, or background." The silence in the room deepened as the board members exchanged looks, each one grappling with the weight of Jacob's proposal. Finally, Lindsay broke the silence. "I agree. It's going to take time, but it's clear that this needs to happen. I'm in." One by one, the others nodded, some more reluctantly than others, but Jacob could see that the tide was beginning to turn. He had done it. He had planted the seed, and now it was starting to grow. The changes would take time, he knew that. But as he looked around the room, Jacob felt a sense of pride in what he had started. This was only the beginning, and the battle for equality, for fairness, had just begun. The following weeks moved quickly for Jacob as the company began to implement the sweeping changes he had called for. The board had officially approved his proposal, and the momentum for change was gaining speed. But while Jacob could feel the excitement bubbling up among the employees, he also sensed the underlying resistance that often comes with large-scale transformations. Some executives had embraced the shift wholeheartedly, eager to be part of the change. Others, however, were more cautious, and Jacob knew that there would be challenges ahead. Still, he remained undeterred. The foundation for a new corporate culture was being laid, and no amount of resistance would deter him from seeing it through. As he walked through the office on his way to a meeting, Jacob noticed the change beginning to take hold. The diversity training programs had started, and people were talking openly about issues they had previously avoided: racial inequality, bias, and the unconscious barriers that had been built into the very fabric of their workplace. Conversations that once seemed uncomfortable or taboo were now part of the normal discourse. Jacob knew that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey. He had made the case to the board, and now it was time to hold everyone accountable, including himself. As he entered the meeting room, he was greeted with a mixture of anxious faces and hopeful ones, all wondering what the next step would be. "Good morning, everyone," Jacob began, his voice steady and confident. "Today marks a critical point in our journey. We've started the process of cultural transformation, but we're not done yet. We still have a long way to go, and it's going to take all of us working together to make this a reality." The team was silent, hanging on every word. Jacob could see the weight of the responsibility settling on their shoulders, but he also saw something else: determination. They were ready for this. They were ready to change. "Over the next few months, we'll be rolling out a series of initiatives aimed at breaking down the barriers that have been built over years," Jacob continued. We'll be revisiting our hiring practices, revising our policies, and most importantly, holding ourselves accountable to the standards we set. I'm asking each one of you to do more than just participate. I'm asking you to lead by example. We need to be the change we want to see, both inside and outside of this organization. Jacob paused, letting his words sink in before he added, "This is not just about changing our company, it's about changing an entire industry. The way we do business, the way we treat people, the way we create opportunities, this is where we set the standard." A slow but steady murmur of agreement passed through the room as the team processed what Jacob had said. There were no more questions, no more doubts. The work ahead was clear. This was bigger than any one person or company. It was a movement, a call to action that would resonate beyond the walls of the office. As Jacob looked around the room, he saw the faces of men and women who were not only committed to the change but were already beginning to take action. This was a pivotal moment, and Jacob knew that this was where the real work began. It wasn't enough to have a vision, it was time to make that vision come to life, and he was ready to lead the charge. As the weeks passed, Jacob found himself deeply immersed in the transformation process, overseeing the implementation of new initiatives designed to root out the biases that had been deeply embedded in the company's culture. The training sessions had gone from being a mandatory exercise to a much-needed conversation that everyone, from senior executives to entry-level employees, was starting to take seriously. Yet, despite the visible changes, Jacob knew that real change would not come easily. It never did. In the boardroom, during lunch breaks, and even in casual conversations around the office, the issue of diversity and inclusion was now at the forefront of discussions. But Jacob had also noticed something troubling. There were those who were resistant to the changes, still clinging to the old ways of thinking, the old patterns of behavior. They weren't vocal about it, but Jacob could sense their reluctance, even hostility, towards the new direction. And he knew that if he was going to make this transformation stick, he would have to confront it head-on. One afternoon, Jacob walked into his office, the weight of his thoughts pulling his shoulders down as he sat behind his desk. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his reverie. It was a text from Nia. "There's been some pushback from HR on the new hiring practices. They're arguing that it will compromise quality." "What do you want me to do?" Jacob sat back, taking a deep breath. This was to be expected. When you challenge the status quo, there will always be those who try to hold on to the old ways. But Jacob wasn't about to back down. He responded quickly, "Tell them to revisit the data. Quality isn't just about experience and qualifications, it's about ensuring that everyone, no matter their background, has an equal opportunity. We're not going to compromise on diversity." After sending the message, Jacob picked up the phone and dialed the HR department himself. It was time to address this head-on. As the HR director, Lindsay Green, picked up, Jacob didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Lindsay, we need to talk about the pushback from your team on the hiring practices. This is critical to the changes we're trying to make. We can't afford to let the old mindset dictate the future of this company." Lindsay, a seasoned professional, didn't take long to respond. "Jacob, I understand the importance of diversity, but the concern here is that we're lowering standards by prioritizing diversity over qualifications. We've always had a certain standard, and I'm worried that this shift might compromise that." Jacob's voice remained calm but firm. "Lindsay, diversity isn't about lowering standards. It's about broadening the definition of what qualifies someone for a role. It's about recognizing the value that diverse perspectives bring to the table. When we focus only on one narrow set of qualifications, we exclude incredible talent. And that, in the long run, compromises our ability to innovate, to grow, and to succeed." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Jacob could almost hear Lindsay thinking it through. "You make a good point," she finally said. "But this is going to take time, Jacob. It's going to be uncomfortable for some people. Change never happens without resistance." Jacob nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I know. But we can't let that stop us. We're not just changing the way we hire. We're changing the culture of this company. This is about building an environment where everyone can thrive, not just a select few." As they wrapped up the call, Jacob felt a renewed sense of resolve. There would be more conversations like this, more pushback, but the path forward was clear. The work was far from finished, but the progress was undeniable. Jacob stood up, his mind already racing with the next steps. He had planted the seeds for change, and now He had to see it through. He knew that the road ahead would be long, but with each day, the company was moving closer to the vision he had set out to create a place where respect, dignity, and opportunity were not just buzzwords but lived realities for every employee. The days following his call with Lindsey Green were a blur of meetings, strategy sessions, and ongoing progress toward the cultural shift Jacob had initiated. He felt the weight of his decisions pressing on him each day, but also a growing sense of momentum as the changes began to take root. He knew there would be bumps along the way. This kind of transformation never happened overnight, but the resistance he had anticipated was starting to feel more like a distant hum, drowned out by the louder voices of those who were embracing the new direction. Jacob had taken the first step, but now the work was intensifying. As he sat in his office one morning, reviewing the latest updates on the diversity initiatives, Jacob reflected on how far they had come. He had spent years building his business, working to prove that he belonged in spaces where others had made assumptions about him. Now, he was changing the very structures that had allowed those assumptions to thrive. The phone rang, breaking his train of thought. It was Nia, his assistant, with an urgent update. "Jacob, there's something you need to know. The media has caught wind of what's happening at the company, and there's a lot of attention. People are starting to take notice, both positive and negative." Jacob leaned back in his chair, letting the news settle in. The media had always been both a blessing and a curse, but this time he knew it could either help or hinder the momentum they had built. "What kind of attention?" he asked, his voice calm but curious. Nia replied, "There's a lot of praise from social justice groups and organizations that are thrilled to see a company taking real action, but there's also pushback from some industry critics who believe you're making too much of a political statement." Jacob felt the familiar tightness in his chest. This was exactly the kind of backlash he had anticipated. He had made the decision to take a stand, and now the public eye would be watching. "We've been expecting this," Jacob said, his tone steady. "This is the price of progress, Nia. Let the critics speak, but we must keep our focus. We are doing this for the right reasons, and no amount of criticism will sway me from that." Nia's voice came through again, softer this time. "I just wanted you to be aware. We've been preparing some statements for the media, but I think you should weigh in on how you want to position this." Jacob thought for a moment before responding. "Tell them the truth. Tell them this is about more than just a corporate initiative. It's about creating a world where opportunity isn't dictated by race, appearance, or background. We're not backing down." There was a pause on the line, but Jacob could hear the approval in Nia's voice when she responded, "I'll make sure that's what we say." As Jacob hung up the phone, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what lay ahead. The media storm was just beginning, but it wasn't going to stop him. The company had already made its commitment, and he wasn't about to let external pressure derail the work they had started. He stood up from his desk and walked over to the window, looking out over the city. It was a beautiful morning, but the work that lay ahead wasn't going to be easy. Yet, as Jacob looked out over the skyline, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The world was watching now, and he was ready to show them what true leadership looked like. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back. The real work was only just beginning. As the days passed, the pressure continued to build. Jacob found himself at the center of a whirlwind of attention, both good and bad. The company was getting noticed, but with that attention came a level of scrutiny he hadn't fully anticipated. The media coverage had reached a fever pitch, and it seemed as though every news outlet wanted to know more about the changes he was pushing. He had become a symbol of corporate reform, of standing up against the systems that had long upheld bias and discrimination. Jacob had been preparing for this moment, but the reality of it was still overwhelming. His phone rang constantly, reporters seeking interviews, employees asking for guidance, and executives pushing for more clarity on the next steps. Yet despite all the noise, Jacob remained focused. He had always known that the hardest part wasn't making the decision to change it, was seeing it through, even when the world seemed to be watching with judgment in its eyes. The pressure began to weigh on him, but he was determined not to let it break him. That evening, Jacob sat at his desk, reviewing the media statements that had been sent out, reflecting on the progress that had been made. As he scanned through the responses, both positive and negative, a message from Nia caught his eye. "Jacob, there's a meeting tomorrow with key stakeholders. They want to discuss the future of the initiative. Are you prepared for this?" Jacob took a deep breath. The thought of another meeting, more eyes on him, made his stomach tighten. but he knew it was necessary. The company had committed to this change, and he couldn't back out now. He replied, "Yes, I'll be ready. Let them know we need to focus on results. The next steps are critical." The following day, Jacob stood in front of a group of the company's top executives, department heads, and key stakeholders. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. He knew what they were expecting: a solid plan, clear metrics, and a roadmap to continue the transformation. Jacob opened the meeting with a direct approach. "I know many of you are looking for reassurance," he said, his voice steady, "and I understand why. We're in uncharted territory, and change like this is never easy, but the stakes are higher than we've ever faced before." The room fell silent as Jacob paused, allowing his words to sink in. "We have the opportunity to lead. We have the chance to build something that not only sets a new standard for the industry, but changes the way we look at success in business. But it's not going to be easy, and it won't happen overnight." Jacob looked around the room, meeting the eyes of those who had doubted him, those who were still unsure of the path forward. "We have already started. We've committed to diversity, to breaking down the barriers that have held people back for far too long. But now, we need action. We need to follow through on our promises." He could see the skepticism in some faces, but also the flicker of something else: hope, determination. "We're going to hold ourselves accountable," Jacob continued. "We'll set measurable goals. We'll track our progress, and we'll adjust our course as needed. But above all, we will remain committed to the values that brought us here: equality, fairness, and respect." Jacob felt the energy in the room shift as he spoke. The weight of the moment hung in the air, but he knew he was saying the right things. The real work was ahead of them, but at least now, they were all on the same page. The meeting ended with a sense of purpose. There was still resistance, but it was clear that the momentum was with Jacob. The next chapter was about to begin, and this time, there would be no turning back. The months that followed were both exhilarating and exhausting for Jacob. The company had officially committed to the transformation, and while there was still resistance from some corners, the shift in culture was undeniable. Employees were beginning to see the real effects of the changes, and the company's efforts to promote diversity and inclusion were becoming a source of pride rather than something to be feared. As Jacob walked through the office one morning, he noticed the subtle yet significant shifts. There were conversations in every corner, discussions that were once uncomfortable, now happening openly. Diversity training was no longer a formality. It was a real, ongoing dialogue. As Jacob entered the conference room for his meeting with the senior leadership team, he could feel the palpable sense of determination in the air. Everyone was focused, committed to the work that was still ahead. As he took his seat, Jacob looked around the room, seeing the faces of those who had stood with him from the beginning and others who had slowly come around, now fully invested in the journey. "We've made a lot of progress," Jacob began, his voice steady and commanding, "but we know that the real work isn't about just checking boxes. It's about creating lasting change." The team nodded, their eyes on him. "We've been tracking the results, and we're seeing the benefits: higher engagement, better retention, a more inclusive atmosphere," Jacob continued. "But we're not done yet. We still have so much more to do." The room fell silent as Jacob's words settled in. There was no illusion that the journey was over. They had come a long way, but the challenges of true change were still in front of them. "Our next step," Jacob said, "is to make sure this isn't just a series of initiatives that we roll out and forget about. We need to embed these values into every part of this organization, from hiring practices to how we interact with our clients. This is about creating a foundation that will support future generations of leaders." As he spoke, Jacob couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. It wasn't just the policies or the training programs, it was the heart of the company, the people. He had shown them that leadership wasn't about being the loudest in the room, but about making the right choices, even when it was hard. He had been criticized for taking a stand, for shaking things up, but now the results spoke for themselves. The company was thriving, and more importantly, they were doing it the right way. "I've always believed that true leadership is about leaving a legacy," Jacob said, his voice steady with conviction. "And I want this company's legacy to be one of inclusion, fairness, and opportunity for all." The room was filled with a sense of purpose. Jacob had done what he had set out to do. He had started a movement, not just within his company, but within the industry. The changes they had made weren't just cosmetic. They were fundamental shifts in how they operated, how they viewed each other, and how they viewed the world. Jacob looked around the room one last time, feeling the weight of everything they had accomplished, but also the knowledge that the journey was far from over. This was just the beginning. He stood up, feeling the fire of purpose burning in his chest. He had taken on the fight for fairness, for equality, and he would continue to lead, not just for his company, but for every person who had been overlooked, underestimated, or silenced. The future was bright, and Jacob was ready to face it head on.